You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello and welcome to the Catholic Mama Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Mooney-Flynn, and thanks for joining me. And I'm not going to leave anybody in suspense for too long, but my husband's here.
Hello again, everybody.
That's Pat.
Always good to be on the Catholic Mama Podcast.
Pat, otherwise known as Patrick. A few other choice nicknames here and there.
From select people, yes.
Your grandmother only called you Patrick.
That's right. And pretty much the only one. You almost never call me Patrick. My
Sometimes
friends never
I do.
call me Patrick.
Would you like me to?
Sure.
I kind of like it.
Starting today.
Okay,
Him,
Patrick. Fine.
Done. Settled.
Our kids are going to be confused.
Yeah.
Sometimes they call you Pat. You notice that?
I do.
It's kind of funny.
A little bit.
Nobody ever calls me Christine.
No, they don't.
So hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. If you listened to last week's episode about what a true Catholic manhood should look like, and you're tuning in this week because you want to hear the inverse of that, what true Catholic womanhood looks like, well, you're in the right place.
This is the spot, my friends.
This is the triggering place.
In today's culture, anything and everything is offensive to someone. But
yeah. Yes, I will say before we hop into exactly, we get into the meat of this conversation, even if you are more on the traditional side of things, sometimes when you actually hear, I'm going to go back and use the Council of Trent, the Roman Catechism for this, just like we used last week's episode. To our modern ears, a lot of this, even if you are more traditional, can be a little disconcerting.
Mm-hmm. There's an important thing here is you don't just judge a culture by its conclusions, you judge a culture by its presuppositions. And there's so much that our culture, even our country, assumes that just goes unexamined. And part of certainly the job of any philosopher is to leave no assumptions unexamined and to see that if these assumptions are justified or if they're not justified. So I think it's very important for people to question. And that's kind of the funny thing, right, is that people who are often religious are accused of being unquestioning. But I find that this accusation is largely just a matter of projection from secular culture. It was the questioning that made me become religious, and that there's so many people who just take for granted the assumptions of modern culture. Certainly the ethical assumptions of modern culture, many of which are absolutely barbaric. And they just assume that these are correct because they grew up with this. Now, isn't that the funny thing? Because you typically hear this charge about religion. Well, you're only Catholic because you grew up in Ohio with a Catholic family, or you're only Muslim because you grew up in Pakistan. If you were somewhere else, it'd be different. And this, for anybody who's ever heard this, is a textbook logical fallacy. It's an informal fallacy called the genetic fallacy. And the idea there is you can't validate or invalidate the truth of some belief or proposition by describing how somebody came to hold that belief or proposition. Rather, you have to evaluate the claim itself independently of how anybody came to arrive at it. Okay, fair enough. Maybe I only believe that the Earth revolves around the sun because I'm born, in the past 30 years. But if I was born in ancient times, I might have believed the opposite. But am I wrong? Right? Maybe that's the only reason I believe that. But am I wrong? The answer is I don't think so, because there's good evidence for this belief. Same thing I would argue for the Catholic faith. The general point I'm trying to make is that what is often hurled at people of religious belief is, I think, a classic form of psychological projection of so many people who are not religious in our modern secular culture who just believe things simply and only because they grew up with them, but never examine those assumptions. Now, again, that doesn't say those assumptions are right or wrong. It's just pointing out we should examine everything. And just because that we grow up in a certain environment with a certain set of beliefs, that does not mean that those beliefs are necessarily correct. So this is very difficult for people to do. But just because something is new doesn't mean that it's better or a good idea. There was a time when National Socialism was the new idea on the block. I don't think anybody would want to concede that that was a particularly great new idea. So anyway, That's a long.
That's good. That's a good baseline to set. So before you get, bristled over what we're going to talk about today, because I'm sure that if anybody listened to last week's podcast on what true Catholic manhood looks like, there's not much to be angry about. They're like, yeah, man should do that. Like that nodding. Okay. Well, now we're going to talk about the inverse of this and what a Catholic woman should do and act like and what her roles are. And I guarantee there are people, and it would have been me a couple of years ago before I realized my errors, that will be like, well, how dare you say that? Well, why would a woman do that? That's unfair. That's sexist. But go back and listen to what a man is expected to do in a Catholic marriage.
Right.
Before you get really, if this happens to be you, get a little bristled about what we're going to say here today. Again, we're using the catechism, the first official Catholic catechism that came out of the Council of Trent in response to the Protestant Reformation. Righto. But even if it's not explicitly said in today's catechism that we use, it's still valid. Everything that's in there is still valid. And These are very good points, especially if you were trying to be countercultural. Our culture today is pretty sick and twisted. And I would say that if you want a healthy family life, a healthy marriage, you want to be as countercultural as possible. And the way you do that is just throw it back to the 1500s and do what they did then. At least, again, in practice, is every marriage perfect? No, there are domineering husbands. There are nasty wives. It's not perfect, but the standard that the Catholic Church has set and has set for hundreds of years for its parishioners, it's wonderful. It's a beautiful thing. So we're going to look at, again, we use the Catholic Catechism from the Council of Trent, the Roman Catechism in last week's episode. Go back and listen to that about the duties of a Catholic husband. And today, as we get into the duties of a Catholic wife, we're also going to be using that as our base.
Right. And yeah, we should say just a few words about tradition, about being a traditionalist or about being a conservative in the proper Catholic sense. And the idea there is you don't just hold on to old ideas because they're old, right? Like you don't need to be a liberal or a progressive to get rid of bad ideas. You just need to have a functioning brain. The idea is if certain beliefs, structures, and systems have been preserved through a very long period of time, the burden of proof for somebody who wants to get rid of those beliefs is on the person who wants to get rid of those beliefs because they seem to be here for a good reason, and we should have some type of argument or evidence against why these are bad before we tear it down. The analogy that G.K. Chesterton gives is if you go into the woods and you see there's a big fence built, right? You probably want to know why the fence is there first before you tear it down. And that's the idea for tradition, right? Well, why are these structures here? For example, the family unit. Why does there seem to be a traditional emphasis on the importance of the family unit? Is there something here that perfects us, that fulfills human nature, that helps us to grow in virtue, which conservatives would argue yes, before we start to inherently try to destroy the family unit? So that's just a way to. The point I'm saying is traditionalist conservatives don't just hold on to ideas because they're old. There's certain ideas that have tradition because they are good ideas, and we argue in favor of these ideas precisely because they are good, not just because they're old. Some ideas are old or bad, and we get rid of those. And again, you don't have to be any type of aggressive to do that. You just have to have common sense.
Yes. I was about to say something, and now I just slipped. Oh, yeah. And I don't know if it's just inherent on modern society, if it was always an issue. But especially amongst us people today, we look back at the past and think, oh, how quaint. They must have been stupid back then to believe all this stuff. They were uneducated. We're so much better and smarter now that we have X, Y, Z. And it becomes, I don't know what the right word would be for that, but we are.
It's called chronological condescension.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Look at that. I knew I had you around for a reason. Yeah. You're like the German language.
That's right.
That's right. You have a term for everything. So I don't know if it was always a thing, but it certainly is now. And we look back and it's like, oh, well, people only believed in a man and a woman with traditional roles in a marriage because they didn't know any better back then. They were just sexist and they were ruled by a patriarchy. That now we're so much more enlightened,
right.
And we need to just destroy all of that. And that's not true. There are very intelligent people that were held strongly to beautiful religious beliefs and social structures, that they really cared about each other and had good brains.
Correct.
so it's not like suddenly in the 20th and 21st centuries there was a huge leap in human neurological evolution.
Understanding. No, this is a really good point. Is that like what is relevantly different between our knowledge of the world today and back then? And most people will point to the sciences, which is fair. There have been huge breakthroughs in the modern sciences that the sciences are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively new. But just because the sciences are relatively new does not mean that that is a relevant difference. The sciences are not ethics. The sciences are not metaphysics. The sciences are not ontology. Understanding the world in terms of the sort of quantitative outline of physics tells us absolutely nothing about the value of a family unit. It just is totally irrelevant. So there's this sort of this weird projectionism, the fact that we just have computers now, but Aristotle didn't. That Aristotle must have been wrong about everything he said in Nicomachean Ethics. That does not follow at all. It's just preposterous. And in fact, I would argue the reverse, that, philosophy sort of had, it's interesting to see a lot of the arts and the disciplines. They kind of, they come on the scene, they ascend, they crescendo, they reach a climax, and then they start to deteriorate. And philosophy was obviously around much longer than the physical sciences. In fact, the physical sciences were just called natural philosophy for a while when they started to develop. And I would argue that philosophy really peaked around St. Thomas Aquinas. The physical sciences come on the scene, and then people start making a bunch of really awful philosophical mistakes. They start going into things like nominalism and mechanism and stuff that is really now in the contemporary philosophical scene being shown to be absolutely, utterly inadequate, that we're seeing this revival, this strong revival in more ancient forms of philosophy that better accommodates the data and what we've learned through the physical sciences, like neo-Aristotelian and Thomistic perspective. So people who say these things and have these chronological condescensions are typically not people who are actually engaged in the modern philosophical debates. They're just ignorant. And when you draw these important distinctions, you realize that you really have no right to hold this chronological condescension. First off, because you didn't invent the computer, right? You have no idea how a computer works. First off, right? You probably don't even know how to clip your own toenails half the time, right? But it's just the sort of assumptions that people have, and it's so hard to take it seriously. But there's no relevant difference there, right? For most people. And as long as you can draw these important distinctions, you realize that the perennial wisdom of some of these thinkers, especially in realms of, yes, like people like Aristotle and Aquinas, they were off in their biology and physics, but they would admit that, look, I could be totally wrong about the physical facts and still be totally right about my ethical or metaphysical arguments and conclusions, because these are different disciplines. They're different ways of coming to know reality. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that I could say about that, but that's probably enough just to show that it's a total bogey and a cop-out for people to want to ignore tradition and the importance of really perennial ideas and perennial thinkers just because we've had some sort of modern technological boom.
So have we hedged our bets enough about before we get into what a traditional Catholic woman's role is?
One other thing too is, like, when we talk about like tradition in terms of knowledge and living, it's important to differentiate between tradition of ideas and tradition of circumstance. For example, there was a time when, like in the cottage industries, right, where, yeah, men and women assumed traditional roles, but still men and women worked close to or even at home. And yeah, the man was the primary provider, but he was still very much around his children and still very much in charge of educating his children and providing for his children's moral upbringing and religious education and things like that in a partnership with the wife in many ways. And that is more of the kind of traditional ideal that we strive for. But then when the Industrial Revolution comes around, people have this caricature of tradition where like the husband goes away for the entire day and the wife stays at home and has the meal ready for him and his slippers ready when he comes into the house and things like that. And that the husband actually has like no active role in raising his children and educating his children. And that's like the idea of like a traditional marriage I think most people have. And that's wrong for Catholics. The husband actually is obligated to take even if he has to leave the house for work. That isn't the like idea of a traditional marriage. The husband has strong obligations to make sure that he is caring for his wife's needs, treating his wife generously and honorably, and also his children. He can't just defer the raising of children to a wife, for example. The husband has specific duties and roles that he needs to fulfill in the lives of children, that if he can't do that throughout the day because of work, he has to make that up somehow as part of his obligation. So I just want to, the demarcation I'm making here is the difference between tradition of ideas and values and virtues versus tradition of circumstance. And people often confuse the two. They look at like the marriage of like 1940s or 50s, right? Like post-industrial revolution. Husband goes away, wife is just in the kitchen. And like that's not how Catholics think of a traditional marriage, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I was just remembering, it reminds me, there was a study a while back that came out that said husbands and wives have happier marriages if they split the household duties more. Mm-hmm. And I think that it isn't just saying like, oh, if the husband does the dishes, everybody's happy. Mm-hmm. It really boils down to, if you look at the research, it's the father-child relationship. Correct. If that is strong, and so if husbands and wives are splitting the household duties, that includes childcare. It's not just, the man leaving the house. He comes home, children are seen but not heard. Right. He gets a drink in his slippers, retires after dinner. Wife does the dishes and puts the kids to bed, et cetera, et cetera. And the happiest marriages, even today. And the headlines will say, oh, it's because, the husband does his chore, his share of the work. Finally, that sexist pig. No, it's that the father spends time with the children and takes an active role in the caretaking and raising and emotional well-being of the children.
That's correct. And again, the traditional view of a Catholic man and husband is to do precisely that. Not necessarily the dishes. We can talk about that. But the point is,
Can we?
Yeah, like fair, like it's like kind of like stupid details. The point is, what's the general thrust of it? The general thrust is that as a man, I have an obligation to my children directly in their moral upbringing, their religious upbringing, part of their education. I don't just defer that to the wife. And that is part of the not just the sharing of duties, I would say that just is my duty specifically. And there was another point I was going to make about, now I forget totally what it is.
Sorry.
But anyway, I was on a roll. It was a great one too. So let's hope it comes back.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. Pat and I sat down and had an episode where we talked very specifically about Catholic marriage. And if you want to listen, it was January 2nd of this year, 2020, episode 79, How to Argue with Your Spouse Like a Catholic.
That's right.
And we did talk about the rules.
Mud wrestling.
Of husbands and wives there in more detail. Today, though, we are just talking after a lot of kind of
preamble.
That's a good word for it. You're very good with the words right now. I'm struggling. Now we're going to talk about the role of a traditional Catholic woman.
The womanly
specifically the wife.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, good.
I remember what I was going to say.
Right.
What you described is not a man looking for a wife. That's a man looking for a second mom.
Man up, men.
That's not a traditional marriage at all.
Catholic man up.
That's right. Catholic man up. So just, again, differentiating between the sort of cartoon stereotype of a traditional marriage and what a traditional marriage actually is. Understanding that husbands and wives have obligations and duties to each other and each to their children as well.
I was reading a book recently that said that Satan attacks the family and the priesthood the most because that is where the saints come from. That is how we get one another to heaven, is in the family and through the church. And if nothing else, I think it's pretty easy for all of us to look at the state of the family over the past 50, say, years and see how horribly it has been wrecked by just cultural opinions, the social mores of the time, laws, politics, everything.
Welfare states.
Welfare, thank you, that welfare state. So,
and it's important, right? Because a lot of the criticism towards some welfare states is it creates absentee fathers. But even in this caricature of a traditional family where the father is just giving himself to his work completely, that he's not there at all for the children, that is an absentee father. That's just as bad. That is failing to meet a moral obligation that the father has to the children, to be there, to have that relationship with the children, to educate them, to raise them, to hear them, to understand them, to discipline them, to love them, all of these things, right?
Yeah. Okay. Now we'll dig in. I'm gonna read, unless you had anything else.
We're 20 minutes in.
We're 20 minutes
barely even scratched the surface.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to read, because it's 3 very short paragraphs. I mean, one of these paragraphs is 2 sentences. I'm going to read the whole part that says duties of a wife. Are you good with that?
Whatever you want to do. It's
Okay.
It's your podcast, my dear.
Well, it's our segment, honey. All right. Okay, so if you search for Roman Catechism and duties of a wife, or Catholic marriage or something, matrimony, you'll come up with this. But I'm under the section of duties of a wife. And right before that, it's duties of a husband, which, again, we covered in last week's podcast about treating a wife generously and honorably, etc. So, on the other hand, the duties of a wife are thus summed up by the Prince of the Apostles, that would be Paul. Let wives be subject to their husbands, that if any believe not the word, they may be won without the word by the conversation of the wives, considering your chaste conversation with fear. Let not their adorning be the outward plaiting of the hair, or the wearing of gold, or the putting on of apparel, but the hidden man of the heart, and the incorruptibility of a quiet and meek spirit, which is rich in the sight of God. For after this manner heretofore the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection to their own husband, such as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. Maybe we should stop there for a second.
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay. I was going to say let's keep going, but nope. The one thing that really popped out at me in this, again, if you asked me this 10 years ago, I probably would have been flushed all over and very angry and maybe yelling at this point.
Throwing a spoon at the window.
Yeah, this would have been bad for me. Now, though, I've come to my senses. One thing that really pops out at me is, wives should have a quiet and meek spirit. Oh, you're just trying to keep women down. You know who said that they have a meek spirit? Jesus
Christ.
Yes, he said,
I am humble.
I am meek and humble of heart. Mm-hmm. All that we are asked, husbands in their way, wives in the other, is to follow in Christ's example. He's an example to all of us. And in that way, it is to be meek. How many times, and I know moms, look, I get it. You know your child better than anybody else. And it is so difficult to say that your way is not the only way, right? And it requires a meekness there, a handing over, a passing of the torch if necessary, to let somebody else have their opinions explored, their way of doing things explored, to keep your mouth shut sometimes when you really want to say something really nasty and smart. It's just consider that as a path to sainthood, one stepping stone towards sainthood. But that just really struck me that years ago, having the Catholic Church telling a woman to be meek, I would have been like, oh my goodness, that's terrible. But it's just asking us to follow in Christ's footsteps, because he also was meek.
Right. And I mean, this is consistent with other teachings of Christ as well, of to love your enemies, for example, and to pray.
Sometimes your husband feels like an enemy.
Well, look, let's be honest. Some marriages are not great marriages, and women are in a pretty bad situation where the husbands can be, frankly, abusive. But remember what we've talked about with the moral law, right? That the moral law is inviolable, meaning you cannot violate God's moral law without incurring moral guilt, without shifting the disposition of your soul away from your proper end of the beatific vision. So any husband that is domineering, that is brutal towards his wife, that is abusive, that is just nasty and mean, is somebody who's growing in narcissism, in egoism, of thinking that the world is all about him, who is not only sending himself to hell, but is living in hell. And the wife who patiently loves her husband in spite of this and bears witness to him, what is she doing? She's growing in holiness, in sainthood. So the final joke the final joke is on that husband, and we pray and we hope that through the wife's patient and enduring example that the husband will eventually repent of that, and that the wife is being sanctified all along, and that God's perfect justice in this will absolutely be manifest in these types of situations. And you can see how that would work, because you find these examples of just wives that are just so holy and patient with their frankly despicable husbands, and their husbands do repent, sometimes at the very end of their lives, right? They're on their deathbed and they're like, I have mistreated you so poorly, and you were so patient and so loving with me, and they're just like in tears and weeping. And then, yeah, they got a hard scrubbing coming up in purgatory, but at least the wife got them there. And that's the point of marriage. The point of marriage is to get each other to heaven, right? You have this sort of elastic band around each other's waist, and you're climbing up this mountain. Somebody may be way behind, and then the other one has to pull through to literally drag the other person up, and they suffer. But that's the commitment we make, and that is love. Love is willing the good of the other for other, no matter how despicable they may be. Now, fortunately, most marriages are not that bad, but we can see even in those extreme circumstances, the prescriptions of Christ is still the solution. It's still the solution in things like this, right?
We are recording this on March 7th, and the gospel reading for today is Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 48. And when you said enemies, love thy enemies, that reminded me of when I read The Word Among Us. WAU.org has a reflection for each day for one of the readings. It could be Old Testament, a Psalm, New Testament, something like that. But I like this today because in one part it said, now the word enemies, quote, enemies, can have a loose interpretation here. It could be a child who misbehaves, a neighbor with whom you've had a feud, a sibling who claims to be too busy to help with an ailing parent. That shows that our enemies might not be, across the sea. It might not be somebody.
Could be abusive parents too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There are things, so our enemies may be very close, and it doesn't mean, a mortal enemy or your arch nemesis, but it could just be, it could be your husband when you guys are arguing in a certain way, or he acts a certain way. He could be an enemy, loosely an enemy in that moment.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, and we are called to love even the worst of us. And of course, that's in the wedding vows itself.
Right, like you don't get to just stop honoring your parents just because some of them were abusive or addicts or anything like that. You have to fulfill those obligations because that's what sanctifies you. That's what makes you holy. That's what orients you towards God. God, who is love, who wills the good of all of us at any moment that we continue to exist just by causing us to exist, which is that ultimate good. So as kind of jarring as these may seem superficially, the deeper theology and a deeper philosophy here is actually quite beautiful.
Yeah. Like I said, this is very difficult for me. I grew up, my mom always told me to stop being so fresh. I was always getting in trouble for my mouth. And it has been a true, very large challenge for me to zip it and not say the hurtful thing just because it feels good for me to say it. And I feel very intelligent and smart for being that quick-witted, even though I'm being just rather sharp instead. And instead of doing the loving thing, which oftentimes is being meek. And that is a very hard challenge. And especially, I feel, being raised in the late 20th century, coming of age, I'm 34, almost 35. So coming of age in the early 2000s, et cetera, et cetera. Women have been told for a number of years now that we are perfect just as we are. Men are not allowed to criticize us in the slightest. I mean, how many times, Pat, I'm looking at you over the years, especially in the early parts of our marriage, I say, how dare you? Right? How dare he say anything like that? And I would have been completely wrong, but how dare he to tell me that I was wrong? So being meek is very countercultural. It's antithetical to the women's movement of today, which tells you to be as loud and brash and frankly disgusting as you possibly can. And if anybody disagrees with you, well, it's their fault.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it is wanting to assume what is the worst of men and put it into women. Right. Which has never made any sense to me.
No. Well, it used to make sense to me, but I also didn't think too much about it. So like I say, this was my biggest struggle point, is the meekness. And it's still something that if I can catch myself before I say something real smart, I just offer that suffering up to the Lord. And I have to try not to congratulate myself that I thought of something that I thought was pretty sharp-witted.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And not say it. But if this is something that you struggle with, just know that it's actually pretty natural based on the culture that we're all living in, which tells women that you are perfect just as you are. You can be loud and bold and take charge, and a man has no right to say anything else. But in a covenantal marriage, yeah, you know what? You got to try to tone that down and be meek, because you would want your husband to be as kind to you.
Well, and that's rights imply duties, and this is really important, and this is why it is very important that the sacrament of marriage, as far as we can make it work, right, that we have a spouse that is deep in their faith, because when I have a rights claim on somebody, that entails that hopefully, preferably, they're willing to fulfill that duty of their moral obligation to give to me what is owed in virtue of what I am as a person and my part in the marital relationship. And clearly, if one partner is failing to live up to their side of the duty of their moral obligations, there's going to be tension. There's going to be difficulty. Now, in that difficulty, you can still find many opportunities for grace and sanctification. But clearly, when each party fulfills their moral obligations, when the husband loves his wife as Christ loves the church and wills the good of his wife and treats his wife generously and honorably, and the wife, of course, fulfills her duties, which we're just going through, there's this beautiful, loving harmony. And we can see how marriage then just becomes a channel of grace for spouses to grow in holiness and grow in greater love for each other and to God, too. So that's what we're working towards. It's that mutual fulfillment of obligation.
Yes. Yes. And I gotta say, I'll do the best I can. Pat does the best he can. We see each other's efforts and we try harder for ourselves. So I've improved simply because Pat's improved, who's improved because I've improved. And we really, again, like that rubber band around each other's waist. Our marriage and ourselves individually have improved simply because we are strapped together in this.
And confession helps so much.
Oh, good old confession.
It really does.
How many times I've gone in there and say, I have sinned. And it is impatience. It is anger at my husband. I'm not a gentle spirit towards him. Said some cutting remarks.
The grace is so effective. It's
Yes.
so real from confession.
Yep.
So it would be remiss not to mention it.
Yes, that's a really good point. I mean, how many times over the years I am a very... I work very quickly. I'm a very efficient person. And when others aren't as efficient as me, children, and my very intelligent but not so commonsensical husband.
That's right.
That is a real struggle for me. And I always would get so frustrated. I didn't know how to improve. I'd get angry and I'd say something about, man, I feel so bad about that. Okay, I'll try better next time. And then next time would roll around, I did not do better, and it was getting very frustrating to me. And it wasn't until I became Catholic and started going to regular confession that it feels like I finally made those leaps and bounds of a change in my mentality. What's the right word for it? Disposition that I never had made in the years prior, despite my knowing that I was
those words up when you need to.
Yeah. Despite me knowing full well that there's something wrong with me.
Cool. All right.
All right.
So keep going?
Right. Yes. Actually, I want to skip something. I want to skip one paragraph and then come back to it. So the third paragraph. Okay. Again, and in this, the conjugal union chiefly consists, let wives never forget that next to God, they are to love their husbands, to esteem them above all others, yielding to them in all things, not inconsistent with Christian piety, a willing and ready obedience. The second paragraph is about kids, so I want to come back to that.
Not inconsistent with Christian piety is the critical thing, that wives, of course, have their primary obligation to God. And this is just Catholic moral and natural law theology, that our moral obligations are always first to the greater person. The greatest person is God, right? That no obligations can overrule our obligations to God. Those are first, primary, of most importance, right? So if your husband is telling you to blaspheme, you can't do it. You cannot do it, right? Your obligations to God would overrule any obligations that you have to your husband. So not and I just want to point that out because that's a very, very important qualification to this relationship.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And of course, a good husband would never ask anything of his wife that would be inconsistent with Christian piety.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They have to follow those 10 commandments throughout in the married state as well. That also includes, I should say, birth control.
Right.
One spouse cannot ask the other to not be open to life.
Correct.
But I also wanted to point out here, this to esteem them above all others. It is so common for wives to put down their husbands to one another. How many times, I guarantee people listening have said really horrible things about their husbands behind their backs with other women, especially over a glass of wine or two. I do. Pat would always joke when I was working in an office that I would go in and tell everybody about our exploits, like in a funny way, you know. And I would, but it was always I was never complaining. It was always just like, you know, they knew Pat, they were friends of mine. So it was just, you know, it was jovial. You know, the time that I sent you out to the store to get marinara sauce and you came back with a bag of marshmallows.
That's right.
Yep. Because he got the first 3 letters right, marshmallows and marinara.
25% success rate. Not bad.
I put that up on Facebook actually, so I get that reminder once a year that happened. You know, so that's not what I'm talking about, where we just, you know, lovingly tease our husbands. That's a good thing to have that jovial spirit towards one another. But I'm talking about being just downright mean about our husbands, whether to their faces or to our friends behind their backs. And that's something that if you find yourself complaining, I mean, really and I know I've said this before on other podcasts, Catholics should be living with the utmost joy. And that includes our marriage. So even if you're struggling with your marriage and your guys are in a tough spot, start to find the joy in the small things, and also cut yourself off before you start saying the bad things.
Correct.
Because the more you say those things, the more you live it.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't start, you know, acting as you believe, you'll start believing as you act. And if you constantly act in ways that are disparaging to your spouse, even if you're just like, you don't even mean it sincerely at first, but you're just joining in the bickering, complaining at people that are around you, that carves out in your dispositions, in your grooves. Like you're just etching out a certain pattern of behavior that is really destructive, that is really unloving, that is really uncharitable, and you're shifting those little nudges towards evil. And you know, the idea of anything like that, any type of sin, any type of uncharity, is we want zero tolerance of it, right? We want to root that out as early and as frequently as possible, because it's that trajectory that can lead to not just, I mean, destructive individual behavior, but of course destructive social behavior and destructive behavior in marriage as well. So that's a good point. And of course that goes equally as well for husbands, right? Husbands should never ever speak lowly of their wives, especially in, you know, around other company. Again, a loving tease here or there. That's very different. We know, you know, everybody knows what we're talking about here. Yeah. Right.
And I think we've always done a pretty good job of that.
Yeah, I agree. Anyway. Even before we were Catholic, I don't think I really ever joined in on that. And mostly because I never had reason to.
That's right, because I'm a perfect wife. Okay. Anything else in that paragraph, or should we go to children?
Can you read it one more time?
In this, the conjugal union chiefly consists, let wives never forget that next to God they are to love their husbands and to esteem them above all others, yielding to them in all things not inconsistent with Christian piety, a willing and ready obedience.
Right. So again, think of the harmony here. The husband wills the good of the wife. So the husband only wills what is good for his wife. And to that extent, you know, what is good for his wife coming down through the great Catholic tradition, what really promotes his wife's flourishing. The wife, why would she want not to yield to that, right? Why would she want to fight against the willing of her own good? It makes no sense. And if the husband tries to will something that is against the wife's good, against Christian piety, she then has the protection and the right to protest to it as well. So these things are well thought out when you actually unpack them.
This isn't just a white man's patriarchy holding down the woman.
It's not just some guy saying, whatever I say goes, right? You do what I say. Have my slippers ready and my
smoking jacket?
My smoking jacket and my whiskey, right? No, it's stupid. It's just dumb. So very good.
It's just dumb. All right. Then, okay, we're going to go back. Second paragraph.
Great.
To train their children in the practice of virtue and to pay particular attention to their domestic concerns should also be special objects of their attention. The wife should love to remain at home, unless compelled by necessity to go out, and she should never presume to leave home without her husband's consent. I kind of chuckled at that one before. But I can tell you, I always tell you where I'm going.
That's right.
Isn't that funny? We just
I
kind
always
of do
tell
that.
you where I'm going.
I know.
too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just like to know where you're going.
Yeah, so let's take that all bit by bit then. So I forget what you even just said.
Well, training the children in virtue.
I mean, that's
pretty common
That is
sensical.
it, right? That's training them in the moral and religious life. What could be more important than that, than learning to love God, love their neighbors, and imitate Christ? That obviously falls both, not just on the wife, but the husband as well. Yeah. That is one of those duties that both.
And going back to joy, I've said this before that I love memes. We were actually just talking about this. I love memes. I really struggle with the ones. I mean, there's lots that I struggle with, but the ones where it's sarcastic women degrading their children in some capacity online. Mm-hmm. That really gets to me. They refer to their kids with 4-letter words, just annoyed, displaying a general annoyance with their children. You are not going to raise virtuous children if you are constantly acting annoyed with them. And the same thing, even if it's just in jest online, you start acting how you believe at some point.
That's correct. You start believing as you act.
Believing as you act. Thank you. So there should be, just as there is a joy in many things in our lives, there should be a joy in caring for children, even though, please, I know it is incredibly hard some days. We had our 2-year-old a complete meltdown for like 6 hours today. The first 6 hours she's been awake.
But then we had like the most pleasant lunch of all time too. So they surprise you in all directions.
But neither of us took it to heart. Mm-hmm. It didn't ruin our days. It didn't feel like it was personal that she cried for a long time.
Sweet baby Isla.
Yeah, she had a hard time today. I stayed up late at adoration last night, and we're like, well, adoration should make her happy. But no.
Yeah, you think it would have been like super calm for the kids. You think they were up like their grandparents binging on that Lego show that they watched.
Ninjago and Sugar. They were at adoration till late last night. And it has totally backfired on us today, except for that beautiful lunch we had. Yeah. I just, you should have joy in this role of motherhood, and not that you have to stay home. Like if there are financial, and I talked about this in my last episode, about transitioning from being a full-time office worker to staying home full-time. If you have to make money because you need to, it's a necessity, and that is very important. You have to take care of the physical needs of your children.
That's right.
Right. So I'm not saying that you have to stay at home,
and neither does the Catechism.
The Catechism doesn't say that either. That's right.
If it's
by necessity,
you
can go have a job, whatever. But if you have children, you should want to be home caring for them.
Right.
You should not Look, a friend of mine years ago could not wait to get off of maternity leave because she just wanted to get away from her baby and get back to the office.
And that's perverted.
It is. It's the wrong sense of things.
It's perverted because, again, what is it getting at? It's getting at a sort of, let's be frank, a sort of egoism, a sort of narcissism. What can I do for me? How can I advance my career, my prestige?
Right. I'm not happy being at home taking care of a baby. Let's get back to what I like to do best.
Rather than loving. What is loving? Again, willing the good of the other for other, properly recognizing the value that another human being has. Now, moral obligations have proximate force. This is really important. You have a special binding moral obligation to your children. Obviously, that you don't have to children that are 1,500 miles away, because you have no, right? Like, you should still care about them, and we have general charity that we have to give about, but we have a special, very forceful binding moral obligation to family in particular. So yes, there is, again, this is one of those things that smacks modern ears as being backwards, but it's absolutely correct. If you are putting your career before your family, and this goes for the husband as well, that is perverted. Because you're just putting yourself before others, and that is not what Christ has taught. That is not the Christian way of living. And that's one specific perversion of it, but it's a pretty profound one, especially since the nature of being a motherhood, of being a mom, is oriented towards not just the birthing, but the raising of children. And you're frustrating that. And moms are perfected in that. You're perfected in virtue by giving yourselves, by pouring yourselves out to your family, to loving your kids. Now, of course, if look, I need to provide for my kids, I need to work to get food on the table for my kids, and I'm doing it for my kids, then yes, clearly that's an act of love. That's a necessary act of love. That's very different than saying, I need to get this amount of prestige or these awards or these honors,
And
and
I guess
I'm going to
yeah.
neglect my kids.
Yeah.
And that's the distinction.
Right. And not, how many, I'm sure we've all heard it, a woman, or we maybe even thought of ourselves, well, I'm working outside of the home because I'm going to prove to my daughters that they can do anything they set their minds to. That's also incorrect. There's much that can be done. And I mean, again, Satan is trying to destroy the family. And he wants to tear us apart very badly because he knows this is where the domestic church,
correct.
This is where saints are made. And we can teach a daughter lots of things without leaving her.
And remember,
unnecessarily.
True freedom, true achievement is not doing whatever you want. True achievement is attaining the beatific vision of becoming most the types of creatures that God intends for us, which is creatures of understanding and love, of knowing the good and willing the good. So just going out and collecting accolades, things of this material world, of being a materialist in this sort of social sense, of just, wanting treasures, awards, prestige. Okay, yeah, you can do that, but just because you can do that doesn't mean that you should do that. That doesn't mean that that is the actual moral life and the objective flourishing and the objective point of being a human being made in the image and likeness of God. So again, another important distinction has to be made, and none of that is to downplay all the cool, amazing things that women have done or can do. It's just keep the greater perspective in mind. All of us, men and women, need to keep that objective end in mind. We're just in such a relativistic society that people forget this, right? And so Marin's awake. She's awake.
Okay, so maybe we should talk about a couple, unless you had anything else to say, maybe a couple of pointers on how to go about all this.
Yeah, so the basics, again, are really important. That in your marriage, living that sacramental life, what are the basics of the Catholic life? Receive the sacraments. Our faith is a gift. Grace is a gift. What does God ask us to do? Just receive. We don't have to work for any of it. Right? We receive the Eucharist, right? No, we don't earn the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. We receive absolution in confession. We just have to tell the truth, right? We just have to open our heart to God, and we receive His mercy and forgiveness. So much of this is just such a pure gift, and we just have to cooperate with God's grace and be receptive to it.
Yeah, I've had a lot of quite a number of women over the past several weeks reach out to me and say that their marriages are kind of in a bad way, and what advice do I have? And it boils down to going deeper into the sacraments.
Become a saint. Become a saint. Light.
Receive the Eucharist. Receive the sacrament of reconciliation. Go to adoration and receive Jesus' presence. Just live that and pray a whole lot. And I think you would be very surprised at the changes. That's not to say that it's not going to be tough. It could feel very well near impossible to change or make anything good happen. Mm-hmm. But marriages, this is a long game. So even if it's tough now, that doesn't mean that it will always be difficult. Somebody I follow online posted a little while ago about two African saints, a husband and wife. And the husband was a real scoundrel for a very long time, abusive, just a horrible man, and converted to the Catholic faith. And him and his wife had a beautiful marriage after that and are both saints now. Wow. Both recognized saints in the church. So even after years of suffering abuse from her husband, she stuck with him. He converted to her Catholic faith, and they became Catholic saints. So there is hope. There is nothing but hope in our religion. And it can be so hard. And that also goes for yourself. I'm not saying the husband's abusive and women just have to slog through and hope for the best. There's hope for you too, ladies. I mean, we're not perfect. And again, how many times I said that, how dare you for contradicting me or calling me out on my own faults at times in the past. There's a lot to both sides need to work on.
Right. And, let's be fair. Women can be extremely abusive as well in other ways. Now, I tend, I guess, to be a little bit harder on men just because I am a man, and I'm often disgusted by the ways that men treat women or fail to live up to their obligations. But we're both human beings. We have obligations to each other in a marital commitment. We have obligations to our children, to our parents, to society at large, and so much of being a Catholic. so much of imitating Christ is making sure that we're living up to those obligations. If you love me, you'll follow my commandments, right? And God will give us the grace to do it. All we have to do, again, is cooperate and receive that grace. So pray in love. And seek to understand. Our faith is an intellectual faith. Not everyone has to live the intellectual life, but try to understand why are these traditions here? What is this wisdom of the church, and why is it so wise? It's obviously you want to be that example to your spouse, especially if if you're married to somebody who maybe isn't religious. But it also helps to have reasons. If they see you living a more beautiful, faith-filled life, and then they inquire, just being able to give some reasons for it can be really, really helpful. Obviously, the example matters, the love and the faith matters, huge. The fundamentals are the fundamentals. Stick to the gospel's the roadmap, right? Christ, it gives us the way. The church provides the means. It's all there, right? It doesn't have to be complicated.
In the meantime, if you are not, again, last episode it was Catholic manhood. We talked a lot about the role of husbands. This is Catholic womanhood, but we're talking a lot about the roles of wives. For anybody, but if you are not yet a wife, or if you are not yet a mother, we should be looking towards spiritual motherhood. Until, or if you never have kids, just taking on that role of spiritual mother, and then also and this includes your friends who you're running with. Run towards Jesus, and then look around to see who's running with you. And if they're not running there too, well, prioritize your relationships, your time, where you're putting it. If you are living your life as a wife and a mother between your coffee in the morning and your wine at night, you got to figure some things out here. Pray. Talk to the Blessed Mother. She is the most perfect mother, a wonderful spouse to Saint Joseph. Ask her for her help, whether through daily rosaries, the Memorare, just quick invocations. Don't forget about praying to her.
All right, I would say amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen. All right. Wow. This is good. I think we covered a lot today. If you don't want to miss any episodes, be sure to subscribe. Until next time, everyone.
Goodbye.
God's beloved, I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
For listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.